Welcome to my scientifically informed insider look at mental health topics. If you find this video to be interesting or helpful, please like it and subscribe to my channel. Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question asks, how can one spot vulnerable narcissistic abuse in a romantic relationship? So I put together this video of 10 signs of vulnerable narcissistic abuse. So as I indicated, this applies to romantic relationships, and with these particular 10 signs, I looked at heterosexual romantic relationships, not only in the scientific literature, but in my clinical experience. So I'm really talking about a specific type of romantic relationship. It's important to remember that when we talk about narcissistic abuse, that in a relationship, both people could have narcissism. So one level of narcissism could be a little higher than another, because narcissism is really on a continuum. Also, there are two types of narcissism, grandiose and vulnerable. I already did a video in the past, 10 signs of grandiose narcissistic abuse. Here I'll just be talking about vulnerable narcissistic abuse. Now, some narcissistic abuse has characteristics from grandiose and vulnerable put together. So it's not always clear-cut, where you have grandiose narcissism on one side, and that contributes to abuse, and then vulnerable on the other, and people kind of fall into one category or another. And to make things even a little bit more complex, sometimes people move from a grandiose narcissistic profile over to vulnerable narcissism and back. We call this oscillation between the different types of narcissism. So it gets a little confusing, but again, here I'm just kind of honing in on vulnerable narcissism. So I'm going to take a look at the characteristics specific to vulnerable narcissism. It's important to understand at first, though, there are some characteristics that we see across both types. That would be self-centeredness, a sense of entitlement, and need for admiration. Those are characteristics of both grandiose and vulnerable narcissism. Now, specific to vulnerable narcissism, we see a low level of extraversion. So somebody who has vulnerable narcissism tends to be introverted, and they tend to have high neuroticism. So anxiety, depression, anger, and other types of symptoms that could come out, especially when somebody's under stress. So they appear to be more sensitive to stressful situations. Now, other characteristics we see that are generally considered unique to vulnerable narcissism, in terms of the narcissism sphere in general, would be this tendency to be resentful, distrustful, to be insecure, to have a lot of feelings of shame, to be hypersensitive to criticism, to be defensive, socially awkward, shy, pessimistic, and to be unforgiving. We also see internal anger and aggression, but sometimes it can also be external. And we see jealousy, which of course we also see with grandiose narcissism, but with the jealousy with vulnerable narcissism, it's more about a feeling of inferiority. So now moving to the list, the 10 signs of vulnerable narcissistic abuse. We see here that these are characteristics, these are signs I've seen associated with vulnerable narcissistic abuse, but there could be other explanations in any particular circumstance. For example, mental disorder symptoms could explain some of these symptoms as well. So the first sign of vulnerable narcissistic abuse is in a romantic relationship. Again, I'm talking about a heterosexual romantic relationship, where we see that somebody starts arguments in which they portray themselves as the victim, when the evidence doesn't really support that they're the victim. And kind of another aspect of this sign is kind of playing the victim from something that happened a long time ago. So maybe the vulnerable narcissist was legitimately a victim, but it happened like 10, 20, 30 years ago, the victimization, and they bring it up kind of as if it's a current issue. So we see a tendency here to be unforgiving, right? Little things just can't be released. They can't let the little things go. And this is interesting because it's kind of consistent with paranoid personality disorder. It has kind of a few features of that disorder. Now, we know when we look at vulnerable narcissism, if we take it to an extreme, there isn't a clear pathology aligned with it like there is with grandiose narcissism. With grandiose narcissism, we see narcissistic personality disorder at the extreme. With vulnerable narcissism, we really don't see that, but we see certain symptoms of certain disorders seem to be present. And this one, as I mentioned, seems to align with paranoid personality disorder. Now, with this first sign, I'm going to introduce the idea of the dark cloud which is kind of one of my theories about vulnerable narcissism, and it ties to several of the signs of vulnerable narcissistic abuse. But here, the unforgiving nature would be just one aspect of the dark cloud that I'll talk about again with some of these other signs. So the second sign is continual negativity. And this just tends to wear people down in relationships. That's why I consider it an abusive sign. The vulnerable narcissist always sees disaster and pain and suffering and grief, and they never really seem to have an optimistic view of anything. So you end up in a situation where it's just all negativity. Now this also ties into the dark cloud, right? There's this idea that there's always a dark cloud kind of hanging over their head, and it kind of extends to other people, and that's when it gets a bit abusive. But this aspect of the dark cloud is more in general and not really specific to a person. So to talk about the dark cloud as specific to a person, I'm going to move to the third sign of vulnerable narcissistic abuse. And that would be the specific dark cloud. That's what I call it. And this is specific to a romantic relationship, to one particular romantic relationship. And elements of this we see would be that there's no forgiveness no matter what somebody does. So sometimes a mistake can be made in a relationship, and there can be a compromise worked out, or somebody can ask for forgiveness, and that can occur. But with this specific dark cloud, no matter what somebody does, forgiveness won't occur. There's no remediation. There's no fixing the problem. The way I've heard described by people in clinical settings is they feel as though they're hated by the vulnerable narcissist. So they always feel like that hatred is there, whether they're being actively abused or not. There's this sense that there's this constant hatred. There's no forgiveness. There's no way to set things right with the vulnerable narcissist. At least that's one sign of vulnerable narcissistic abuse. Now, to move on to the fourth sign, we see that there are a lot of non-productive arguments that occur in the context of these relationships. There's no progress, and just like with the third sign, there's really no compromise. No compromise occurs that kind of heals whatever the argument is about. So the argument just continues, and it's kind of a war of attrition, right? There's no response that's adequate. Just like the third sign, there's nothing that can be said that can fix it. So it just becomes this war of attrition. It's simply just abuse. It's arguing just to cause pain because there is no acceptable solution. So in a sense, sometimes somebody who has vulnerable narcissism, they can tolerate arguments better than somebody who doesn't. Not most of the time, interestingly, but some of the time they can, and they can use this ability to just wear the other person down. I think the grandiose narcissist actually has more of this ability, but when we see it activated in vulnerable narcissism, it can be strong. I usually think of it with vulnerable narcissism as much more time limited, though, because again, eventually the vulnerable narcissist isn't going to want the argument either. And then what I find is that they want to end the argument quickly. So they look for a resolution to the argument really quickly after they've been causing the argument for days or weeks. So that's the fourth sign, non-productive arguments. The fifth sign is this idea that anger and hatred are just below the surface all the time, right? It's kind of like handling an unstable explosive. It might not explode, but it may explode, and you never know when that's going to happen. The victims of vulnerable narcissistic abuse, what I've found, tend to know what they could say to start a fight with a vulnerable narcissist if they wanted to start a fight. So it's not like they have to have a few tries to say something to cause the fight. They always know the right term or subject matter or whatever they can bring up, the right topic that can generate a fight. Not that they would do this, but it's always having that knowledge. Again, the anger and the hatred just below the surface and very easily activated. The sixth sign of vulnerable narcissistic abuse is when somebody in a romantic relationship like this accuses the other person without evidence on a regular basis, and this tends to be around like affairs and infidelity, like so accusing somebody of having too much interest in another person, right? So they're highly jealous. And this moves back to kind of the victim dynamic, and this is interesting because it connects back to some of the symptoms we see with two different personality disorders, borderline personality disorder, as well as paranoid personality disorder, which I mentioned before. So the seventh sign of vulnerable narcissistic abuse is sexual narcissism, and this was also a sign for grandiose narcissistic abuse, but with that type of narcissism, with grandiose narcissism, we see this tendency for the grandiose narcissist to want somebody to submit sexually in order to prevent a fight or to prevent the narcissist from leaving. So the sexual interest becomes kind of increasingly dominant or humiliating. With vulnerable narcissism, it's a bit different. The pressure to have sex is to prove that you love that person enough, to prove that you won't leave them. And this really ties in quite strongly with characteristics we see from borderline personality disorder. So here it's not so much about kind of domination, but a continual need to prove that you love someone enough. And ostensibly, of course, the act of sex kind of proves that, but of course it really doesn't, and this just leads to other problems. But either way, this type of sexual narcissism characterizes vulnerable narcissistic abuse. Sign number 8 involves poor listening skills. This seems to be a problem with both grandiose and vulnerable narcissism, but what's interesting about vulnerable narcissism and this sign is the poor listening skills are often disguised as good listening skills. So it's not always obvious that somebody's not listening, which kind of speaks back to another term used for vulnerable narcissism, which is covert narcissism, kind of suggesting that this type of narcissism is a little harder to detect. And with sign number 8 here, the poor listening skills, we can see that seems to be the case. So what happens is that somebody who has vulnerable narcissism can attend to a conversation good enough to kind of pass as a good listener, while really they're off in their own world. So this really speaks to kind of the low extraversion characteristic or the introversion characteristic. So they're able to kind of think about something, maybe analyze another situation or be off kind of in a fantasy while pretending to be a good listener. Sign number 9 is a disgust for friends outside of that romantic dyad, right? So somebody's in a relationship with a vulnerable narcissist. That narcissist is going to have disgust for that other person's friends. And this comes down to jealousy, and specifically jealousy of time spent with other people or attention paid to other people. So if you're on the phone with somebody like a friend and the vulnerable narcissist kind of comes into the room, they want you to end that phone call, they want your attention. That's really kind of the jealousy component taken to an extreme. And what they might say is you're not prioritizing well, you're not putting them first, so there's kind of a guilt trip that's played in the situation. And if we look at the scientific literature, this gets connected to the high attachment anxiety that we see with vulnerable narcissism, and also the possessiveness, which is really a key component of vulnerable narcissism in romantic relationships. So moving to the last sign of vulnerable narcissistic abuse. I saved this one to the end because I think it's kind of important in how it differentiates grandiose narcissism from vulnerable. And this is repeated grand efforts to change, failed attempts at reform. That's what we see with vulnerable narcissism. What we kind of see here is a struggle at some level, right? Like the vulnerable narcissist kind of realizes that change would be helpful. They realize that something isn't quite right in the relationship. And unlike the grandiose narcissist, they do want to make some sort of effort to change that. They see it, they know something's wrong, and they want to change it. But again, what happens most of the time is there are these grand efforts, but they still fail in the attempt at making any type of lasting or meaningful change. So in a sense, there's better insight with this type of narcissism. There's, again, that realization that something is wrong, but it's hard to act on that to accomplish some sort of meaningful change. I do think, though, that when the grand efforts for change are available, when that effort seems to be taking place, that's a good time to see a counselor. I think really any time is a good time to see a counselor when we see vulnerable narcissistic abuse, but in particular when somebody seems to be more open to changing. So I think that would be a good time to involve a counselor and try to capitalize on that desire to change, because a lot of time that desire leads to efforts that are kind of misdirected, and maybe the counselor can point somebody in a more productive direction. So I know whenever I talk about narcissism and abuse in these different topics. There are going to be different opinions, people that agree and disagree with me on different points. Please put your opinions on this in the comments. It always generates a really interesting dialogue. As always, I hope you found this description of 10 signs of vulnerable narcissistic abuse to be interesting. Thanks for watching.